Anne Boleyn was the great-granddaughter of Thomas Butler, the 7th Earl of Ormond, and Catherine of Aragon's closest and most trusted advisor. Her grandmother was Thomas Butler's daughter, Lady Margaret Butler, and her father was Thomas Boleyn. She was a maid of honor to King Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, when Henry became smitten with her. In order to win her favor, Henry took the Earldom of Ormond away from Red Piers, the 8th Earl of Ormond, and gave it to Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn. But that isn't the end of Anne in our story. It's just the beginning. Henry VIII had a problem. His problem, known as the King's Great Matter, was that he desperately wanted a male heir, which his wife of 24 years was unable to give him. He decided the best solution to his problem was to annul his marriage to Catherine and marry the much younger Anne, who he hoped would produce his male heir. As a committed Catholic, the only way he could annul the marriage was with the permission of the Pope. Unfortunately for Henry, Pope Clement VII wouldn't grant the annulment. Determined to get what he wanted, Henry and his advisors began to break the Catholic Church's power in England. Henry ultimately assumed supremacy over all religious matters, and not surprisingly, his marriage to Catherine was declared invalid shortly thereafter. He formally married Anne in 1533. Not long after Henry VIII married Anne, they had a daughter, Elizabeth. This was quite a disappointment because they had been told by the royal physicians and astrologers that they would have a son, the male heir that Henry wanted so badly. In 1536, Anne found herself pregnant again and knew that her life wasn't going to be roses and unicorns if she failed to produce a male heir. Henry, perhaps in an effort to cover his bases, began courting Jane Seymour. As fate would have it, Anne miscarried what was reported to be a male child on the very day that Catherine of Aragon was buried. Some might say that was a pretty big coincidence. The miscarriage was the beginning of the end for Anne. While she was recovering, Henry said that he was seduced into the marriage with Anne by deception or spells and moved Jane Seymour into royal quarters. But in order to marry Seymour, Henry had to find an official reason to end his marriage to Anne. He decided, high treason was as good a reason as any, and Anne was arrested and put in the Tower of London in May 1536. Before a jury of her peers, including a man she was formerly engaged to and her own uncle, she was convicted of treason. She was also convicted of adultery, incest, and plotting to kill the king for good measure. She was beheaded 4 days later. This is a picture of the area where Anne was executed at the Tower of London. Her execution marked the start of a period of political and religious upheaval known as the English Reformation. She's considered one of the most influential and important queen consorts in history because she set in motion the events that led to the English Church's independence from the Vatican. But Anne's most important contribution was really her daughter, the most famous member of the Butler family. Following a game of musical thrones that saw Edward VI, Lady Jane Grey, and Bloody Mary at the royal helm, Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, the great-granddaughter of Thomas Butler, 7th Earl of Ormond, became Queen Elizabeth I of England and Ireland in November of 1558. She was 24 years old. Like one of her earlier ancestors, James Butler, the 4th Earl of Ormond, Queen Elizabeth was known for her learning and wisdom. She was considered one of the best educated women of her generation and spoke French, Flemish, Italian, Spanish, Welsh, Cornish, Scottish, and Irish. In 1603, the Venetian ambassador was quoted as saying, "She possessed languages so thoroughly that each appeared to be her native tongue." But the thing Queen Elizabeth was perhaps best known for was her virginity. In fact, along with the nickname Good Queen Bess, she was often called the Virgin Queen. In 1559, she told the House of Commons, "And in the end, this shall be for me sufficient, that a marble stone shall declare that Queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin." Over time, her unmarried status actually inspired a cult of virginity similar to the Virgin Mary. In poetry, she was often depicted as a virgin or a goddess, not a woman. In truth, she probably wasn't inherently pious. Some historians believe that her virginity was the result of inappropriate sexual advances she received as a teenager from Thomas Seymour, who had married her stepmother, Catherine Parr, after Henry VIII's death. As queen, one of Elizabeth's main goals was to increase England's naval strength. Under her watch, lots of technical improvements were made to English ships that enabled them to carry heavier guns, sail faster, and outmaneuver ships from other countries. This naval superiority led to lots of pirates and privateers, known as sea dogs, who raided Spanish merchant ships carrying gold and silver from the New World. Elizabeth, seeking to acquire wealth for the kingdom, risked war with Spain by looking the other way, as long as the sea dogs shared their spoils with the crown. In 1584, Elizabeth set in motion a plan to establish England's presence in North America. She gave Sir Walter Raleigh a royal charter that authorized him to explore, colonize, and rule any remote, heathen, and barbarous lands, countries, and territories not actually possessed of any Christian prince or inhabited by Christian people for a period of 7 years. For his efforts, Raleigh was to receive 20% of all the gold and silver that might be mined from those lands. Raleigh's colonization attempts in the New World were ultimately unsuccessful, mainly due to lack of supply ships. But he did succeed in claiming a large piece of territory for England that included present-day Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. Collectively, that territory was named Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen herself, Elizabeth. Her early efforts eventually paved the way for the London Company to establish the colony of Virginia as the first permanent English colony in the New World. So Queen Elizabeth I, a Butler family member, played a prominent role in settling what would become America, and even has a state named after her. On the cultural front, Elizabeth's reign from 1558 to 1603 was known as the Elizabethan era and the Golden Age in English history. Against a backdrop of royal stability, poetry, music, and literature thrived, and playwrights like William Shakespeare revolutionized the theater. So if you hated studying Shakespeare in high school, you can partially blame a Butler family member, Queen Elizabeth I. Remarkably, Elizabeth I had a 45-year reign as queen. I say remarkably because she was the subject of several death plots. At different times, high-ranking officials in Paris, Madrid, and Rome all sought to kill Elizabeth, who was a Protestant, and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic. Fortunately for Elizabeth, all the plots were thwarted. She died from natural causes in 1603, at approximately 70 years of age. Without a direct heir to the throne, Elizabeth was succeeded by her first cousin twice removed, James I, who was a son of Mary Queen of Scots and a great-grandson of King Henry VII. Thomas Butler was born in Ireland, but sent to London as a young child at the request of his father, James IX Earl. He was educated with Henry VIII's son Edward, who would later become King Edward VI, and Elizabeth, who would later become Queen Elizabeth I. Thomas and Edward were close throughout their lives, but he became a favorite companion of Elizabeth, who called him Black Tom and her black husband, presumably due to his dark hair. You'll often hear him referred to as the Black Earl. When his father died, Black Tom inherited the titles 10th Earl of Ormond, 3rd Earl of Ossory, and Viscount Thurles. He also inherited the highly lucrative Prisage of the Wines, hundreds of thousands of acres, and dozens of castles and manors in Ireland. For the most part, County Tipperary was under his independent jurisdiction rather than the Crown's, and he maintained a private army of about 1,000 men to defend his land. Throughout most of the 1500s, the Butlers led by Black Tom, and the Geraldines, led by Gerald Fitzgerald, 15th Earl of Desmond, and coincidentally the third husband of Black Tom's mother, continued their feud. Things came to a head in 1565 in what became known as the Battle of Offan. During the conflict, Black Tom's brother, Sir Edmund Butler, shot Gerald Fitzgerald in the right hip, cracking his thigh bone and throwing him from his horse. The Butler forces killed about 300 Geraldines that day in a decisive victory that was one of the largest private battles ever fought in Britain or Ireland. When Queen Elizabeth found out that two private armies had formed and fought without her knowledge or permission, she summoned both earls to her court. Not surprisingly, Black Tom, the cousin she had been close to since childhood, managed to convince her that the battle was Fitzgerald's fault. And, according to most historical accounts, it probably was. The Queen fined Fitzgerald and threw him and two of his brothers into the Tower of London until 1573.
Hold the line!
Back in Ireland, members of the Desmond Fitzgeralds started new rebellions against the Queen. Black Tom lobbied Elizabeth for command of the war against them, which she granted. In time, the Earl of Desmond was captured and beheaded, and the rebellion extinguished. More importantly, about 300,000 acres of Desmond land was confiscated and given to English settlers, which effectively ended the Fitzgerald dynasty. The Butlers' primary enemy had been defeated. In 1585, Black Tom returned to court in England as a conquering hero. Having proved his worth on the battlefield, Queen Elizabeth now needed him in the war with Spain. He helped prepare the English army for a Spanish invasion and helped devise England's military and naval strategy. Over the course of his military and political career, Black Tom held titles including Treasurer of Ireland, Lieutenant of County Tipperary, Lieutenant of County Kilkenny, Lord General of the Forces in Munster, General of the Forces in Leinster, Lieutenant General of all forces in Ireland, Vice Admiral of Leinster, Knight of the Garter, and Earl Marshal of England. Few Irish noblemen had more importance in English affairs. Beyond his military and political contributions, Black Tom also made an important contribution to the Butler real estate empire. In the 1560s, he built a manor house as part of Ormond Castle in Carrick-on-Shore in County Tipperary. He built it in anticipation of a promised visit from his cousin, Queen Elizabeth. By all accounts, it's the best example of an Elizabethan manor house in all of Ireland, and it's known for its exquisite decorative plasterwork portraits of Elizabeth. Black Tom wanted everything to be perfect for her visit to his home in Ireland, and he spared no expense. Unfortunately, Elizabeth died before she was able to visit. You, however, are able to visit Ormond Castle anytime you like. It's open to the public and well worth the trip.